Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, Jesus himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil. Today we begin a new series, He Saves Us, starting with our hero's victory over that dragon.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Welcome, good traveler, to the kingdom of Fantastical Truth. This is the podcast from Lorehaven.com in which we explore fantastical stories for God's glory, watching out for dragons. I'm Stephen Burnett, Lorehaven's publisher and co-author of The Pop Culture Parent.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and after careful consideration, I have decided not to endorse Jurassic Park because there are a shocking lack of dragons, or are there? So this is episode 203, How Did Jesus Save Us from That Dragon, the Devil? And we're going to be joined by special guest Laurie Christine in just a moment.
Laurie's written a book. It's kind of a combination Bible study and fictional retelling of that dragon, the devil, and the good heroes who oppose him. But in this episode, we're going to talk about dragons all throughout the ages, good dragons, but mostly bad dragons. Dragons started out as a symbol of evil, starting right there in the scripture. They're almost always monsters to be slain, and yet in Christianity, in biblical gospel Christianity, the dragon has already been dealt his death blow, and we're going to explore that as part of this new series, He Saves Us, as we are leading up to the Passion season, the Easter season, Resurrection Sunday, whatever you call it.
You know, Stephen, I just saw Dune Part 2. Well, with you, obviously, we were there together, and it just hit me that the sandworm in Dune is basically a dragon, right? But it's sort of a good dragon. It's sort of a bad dragon. It's sort of blurring the lines a little bit, and I think even later in the series, a character becomes a sandworm. And so again, it's that, are they good? Are they bad? Should you aspire to be one? It's kind of weird how this whole topic of dragons has evolved over literature.
Sounds like some sort of a hybrid creature there, Zach, which leads me to our top sponsor, Enclave Publishing, for this episode with their new release, Hybrid, from author Candace Cade. After narrowly surviving several attempts on her life, Lee Urban retreats into hiding, seeking refuge with her family for the Lunar New Year. But the relaxing holiday turns into a heist when someone crashes the party with intel on the hybrid's identity. Driven by desperation, Urban accepts a position within the elite Dragons AI team, a high-stakes gamble that will propel her into the heart of the turbulent West. As she follows the elusive clues to the hybrid, the journey takes her closer to uncovering the truths about her own origins and the odd circumstances surrounding her adoption. Tensions between the enhanced and naturals grow increasingly violent, and the Western Federation teeters on the brink of civil war. Urban's choices threaten to tear her family apart, and the secrets she unearths just might shatter the delicate balance of society. Enclave presents Hybrid, the second book in Candace Cade's Hybrid series. It's on sale now wherever great YA books are sold. You can also get it as a digital audiobook on Audible, Spotify, and through libraries everywhere. See the cool cover, get more info in our show notes for episode 203, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast. Dragon there too. Dragons everywhere. Dragons in all kinds of stories. You type in the word dragon at lorehaven.com, and there's no end to the amount of books that you will fetch in the Lorehaven library, where we list every Christian-made fantastical title that we know, including stuff we've reviewed and stuff we haven't reviewed. But we do post weekly reviews at lorehaven.com, and we have monthly book quests in our Lorehaven Guild, and you can subscribe free and get updates about everything we do and get your secret access code to the Lorehaven Guild on Discord, subscribing free at lorehaven.com. All right, let's prepare for the arrival of our guest, Laurie Christine, who has just apparated into the studio, and fortunately it was not on school grounds. Laurie Christine is an author, podcast host, certified biblical parenting coach, Bible teacher, wife, and mom to 4 wild, loud, adventurous boys. Yes, her podcast, Redeeming the Chaos, invites moms of boys to join her on the wild, wonderful, chaotic adventure of raising courageous boys and connecting them with Christ. Her most recent book, released last November, Rise of the Enemy, which is the first in her Dragon Slayer Bible series. Laurie, it's great to see you. Welcome to Fantastical Truth.
Hey, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Great having you, Laurie. So how many dragons did you slay on the way to the podcast today?
Hey, Zach. Well, just a few, but I made it. I was, I thought about riding a dragon in, but I decided apparating would be the quickest way to get here.
That's right.
Apparition always makes me hungry, so let's get out a few quick concessions before we start this episode. Maybe you, faithful listener, like fantasy dragons, and maybe you don't like hearing about these evil dragons. You prefer the kinds of dragons in fantasy that you can befriend or ride or tame. Those are the kinds I like those too. I'm a big fan of How to Train Your Dragon. There were dragons when I was a boy. I love the idea of dragons as these magical, benevolent, and yet sometimes dangerous creatures. And some dragons are even cute and cuddly. So we're not going to critique that imagination here. But we do note that dragons throughout the Bible are generally portrayed as evil. The serpent is a symbol of evil, even going back to Genesis 3. We're going to explore more of that, while also allowing for the fact that Scripture itself portrays at least one great sea dragon, Leviathan, a.k.a. Godzilla. Look him up. He has the same power set. In Job 41, Leviathan is portrayed as basically God's pet. It's God arguing to Job, have you seen or even heard of the great sea beast, Leviathan? No one can tame him. No one can survive him. And by the way, I made that. So how much more powerful is me? But throughout the Scripture, the dragon otherwise, either by name or the nickname of serpent, is traditionally emphasized as devilish. So that's the theme now as we move toward Easter and exploring our hero, Jesus Christ. Laurie, Zach, any other quick concessions there?
I mentioned at the beginning dragons and dinosaurs and the whole connection there. And I've just been recently watching some content from Answers in Genesis about this. And it's kind of a fascinating thing. But I'll just admit I'm catching up on this topic. So you, our listener, may have thought much more deeply and studied this much more at length. So bear with us as we dive into some of that. But I think the most compelling thing that I've been reading about is how there are these rock carvings throughout the centuries and throughout all these different cultures of creatures that look like dinosaurs or dragons. And, how many hundreds or thousands of years old are those? It's a really cool thing to look at, especially I think the one that really stood out to me was the one that looked like a stegosaurus. I'm like, that is such a specific dinosaur. That's like, that couldn't just be something else. So it's clear that dragons are very much a part of almost every culture in the world, along with the flood, the story of the flood. But this is not the archaeological podcast where we go into all those details and discuss and debate them, but just acknowledging that is out there. And I think it's something everyone should check out.
Zach, one of the things that I learned in my research is that the word dinosaur was only invented in the 1800s, like 1840.
It is extremely new word.
And before that, what word did they have? The word that they had in literature and in culture was dragon. Like, that's how they would have described if they came across these giant bones of this monstrous creature. And the word dinosaur actually means giant lizard or terrible lizard, I think it is. Yeah. So, we think, oh, well, dragons weren't real, but dinosaurs, absolutely, they were real. But dinosaurs only existed for, the term dinosaur only existed for a couple hundred years.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that was interesting in that AIG videos where who's the dragon and dinosaur guy at AIG? What's his name?
Oh, they have a few of them.
Bodie or Bodie?
Bodie Hodge is one
Bodie
of them.
Hodge.
Yeah, they have a lot of writers who've written about that. I remember Ken Ham specifically talking about this.
Yeah, so he or his co-host pointed out how even the word or even the concept of dragon was until like 1902 or 1912, like early 1900s was pretty much considered, like by the Encyclopedia Britannica, was considered normal that there were dragons in the world. And then like 8 years later, they said, well, it's probably just a myth. And so I'm really curious to know like what made that change, because we've all seen that in our day where things get changed in the dictionary or the encyclopedia, whatever. And we can see the cultural forces at work, but what were those cultural forces in 1902 that caused that to happen. And I don't know what that process was, but that it's just so interesting that up until that point, it was just accepted that, oh yeah, dragons were in the world.
And there's really not much difference between a dragon and a dinosaur other than, wings and breathing fire. But I'm guessing that if there were dinosaurs with wings, dinosaurs with feet and wings as opposed to a pterodactyl, the wings probably would not have survived. And certainly any strange mechanism for breathing fire would not have survived. AIG goes into this a little bit more, that there are creatures living now who expel chemicals. So how could it be completely impossible for a dragon to do the same? But we'll get to that in chapter 2 and 3 as we're moving backward in time. The dragons still persist, at least in fantasy literature. In chapter 1, let's talk about slaying the dragons in modern storytelling. We love dragon slaying stories. I think now it's just unquestionable. There's still monsters in stories, whether it's Godzilla or Smaug in The Hobbit, or even the dragon-like Balrog in The Lord of the Rings. There's some of these classic stories barely 100 years old that still preserve the old idea of hero must slay dragon. Folks aren't turning into dragons or taming the dragons. The dragons are still a symbol of evil and sin, and they're terrible lizards. And by the way, a late concession here: the words "terrible lizard" would be a great name for a rock band. Apologies to Dave Barry for stealing his joke. I think the reason why heroes still slay dragons in fantasy stories is an echo of that original idea in the Bible, which we'll get to later on in chapter 3. But I wanted to ask you all, there's a few other stories that still preserve this general motif of hero slays dragon without a whole lot of moral nuance to it. The original Godzilla, for example, is basically just another kind of dragon. I mean, he breathes fire and everything. The only thing he doesn't have is wings, and he emerges from the ocean rather than a cave. And yeah, it's atomic breath instead of fire, but it's basically the same thing. And right up until the amazing Godzilla -1 film late last year, Godzilla has been presented as a destroyer, the American movies and other adaptations notwithstanding. I see some Harry Potter books on your shelf back there, Laurie. So how do dragons appear in the Harry Potter series? Like, there's dragon-like monsters. Lord Voldemort himself, for example. Like, what's your take on evil dragons in the Harry Potter books?
Yeah, so I am a big fan of Harry Potter. Yeah, as you can see, lots of books on my shelf there. It is interesting because there are actual dragons, the beasts of the dragons in Harry Potter, but they're not like the epitome of evil. They're just kind of like these magical beings. But if you look at some of the symbolism, like you said, with Slytherin, the House of Slytherin is kind of the embodiment of evil, and their emblem is a snake, and they can speak parcel tongue, and Lord Voldemort is like the ultimate evil. So he is this dragon. He is this serpent of evil, the serpent of chaos in the story. And even Draco Malfoy, who's kind of like one of the minions of the ultimate dragon in that story. Draco, the name Draco means dragon, which is something I mean, I've read those books so many times, and I just realized that recently as I was doing research. I was like, oh, he's a dragon. They're fighting against this evil dragon of Slytherin and Voldemort, who's a descendant of Slytherin, and then finally he's defeated at the end. And interestingly, and I know you guys have mentioned this in your podcast before, Harry, who's kind of like a distant Christ-like figure in the books, he has to die in order to ultimately defeat this dragon. And I just love that. I love that there are echoes of the gospel, the heart of the gospel, in so much literature, whether they were intentional about it or not. We can redeem that. The title of my podcast is Redeeming the Chaos, whether it's in our homes with raising boys or in our culture with like dragon stories. Like, how do we see the gospel? Where do we see the gospel, and how can we pull those stories out and see the truth in those stories?
Yeah, I think why dragons are such an appealing monster is, first of all, because they're reptiles. Like, so it's just such a different species than a mammal. Like, it's so other. There's King Kong, I guess, and there's other sorts of monsters that are mammal-ish, but there's something so much worse about a reptile because it's so different than humans and other similar animals. And it's like why there's kind of the joke about the lizard people, that are running the government, or the lizard people from outer space, like the reptilian aliens. There's just something about that implicitly makes us really afraid. And I mean, I've got several girls, daughters, and yeah, anytime we found like a snake in the backyard, it's not a happy day for them. There's something very just gross about it. And then you scale that up to the size of a dragon. Now we're talking about something huge, something dangerous, something that prowls, that hunts you. It's hard to defeat a dragon. It's, you can, I mean, a snake is pretty terrifying in a way, but you can step on it. You can take a rake to it. A dragon, not so much. It's, it's got armor essentially. And it's sort of this agent of chaos that just disrupts everything. The Bible Project had a good video about the dragon as a symbol of the chaos of the world. And that's what Jesus came to defeat. It's just the perfect symbol of like everything inhuman and wrong and scary and foreboding.
Well, you mentioned, Laurie, that in the Harry Potter books, the dragons themselves by name are basically neutral yet extremely dangerous creatures. I don't think anyone ever tames dragons. Hagrid might have tried, but it didn't work out very well. And it's probably a better way to portray them if you are to have them in a world like that, is just to show, hey, there's some stuff that mankind or wizard kind in his hubris cannot tame. There's some magical beasts that can be tamed. You can bow to a hippogriff and then he'll respect you and then maybe even let you ride him. But dragons, yeah, not so much. And yet dragons can be a victim of some other people's sin. For example, the dragon that's locked and tortured deep beneath the Gringotts wizarding bank. And yet on the evil side, it's no accident. Yeah, as you mentioned about Voldemort, all the satanic imagery surrounding him. Of course, he's literally carrying around a giant snake. There's definitely no subtlety there. And all the other little serpentine symbols, even the basilisk in book 2, as this kind of this serpent dragonoid type beast that must be defeated. In other stories, though, like dragons show a little bit more moral nuance. Like I still consider the Chronicles of Narnia newer on the timescale of these stories. And oddly enough, you don't get a whole lot of dragons in the Chronicles of Narnia, just one or two in book 3, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where a dragon is a symbol not so much of Satan, but of human sin. Because famously, Eustace Clarence Scrubb is transformed into a dragon because he's being selfish. He's laying in a dragon's cave on a dragon's treasure. And so naturally, what would happen if you'd read the right books, you would have known you turn into a dragon yourself. And it's one of the most famous redemption motifs in all the Chronicles of Narnia. I mentioned the recent American Godzilla films. Like, I'm not too thrilled about the direction they're going now, but they started out showing Godzilla as, this dragon-like creature as kind of more like a force of nature who's a hero or anti-hero. I mean, he's dangerous. He's not tame, but ultimately Godzilla is good. So it's kind of interesting to see a creature like that in a newer story who's not Aslan. In Christian-made stories, as I said, go to Lorehaven.com, type in dragons. You'll find all kinds of titles with all kinds of different takes on the critters. One of the most popular ones is Brian Davis. I basically think of him as, oh yeah, he's that dragon guy, although he writes lots of stuff. But his original series is called Dragons in Our Midst, which has teenagers who have dragon-like characteristics, and they're not evil. He's got this whole legendarium behind, why they're turning into dragons, why one's able to breathe fire and why one has wings folded up inside her backpack. It's a very interesting take on that, and it kind of harkens to this original idea that dragons, because they existed, I think, I'll get to that in a moment, were originally created good. And so it's not so much that there's a uniformly evil creature in the Bible. It's just that that's how it turned out. They got associated with that later on, probably because of Satan the serpent. And then if you look in the library for all of those pre-flood set fantasy novels set in the world before the flood, a lot of them also show dragons or hint toward the idea that dragons were originally created good. Do y'all prefer, like either one of you, preferred stories with dragons as good, evil, or neutral, or kind of a mix?
I mean, I love all sorts of stories. I think I would prefer them as evil. I kind of would lean towards those. But I was just thinking, I mean, I really love some of the more modern stories too. My boys have really enjoyed like Wings of Fire or How to Tame Your Dragon. Like those are all kind of like the dragon starts as evil, but they're actually really good. They actually have a good side. And maybe we misunderstood them. We misunderstood the dragon in these stories. And I think those are fun stories too. And interestingly, the Wingfeather Saga we just read recently with my boys, and I know you guys interviewed Andrew Peterson. But there are dragons that represent evil. The fangs are these lizard, snake-like evil creatures. And then there's like the ancient sea dragon who is trying to kill Podo, and he is this force of evil. But then at the end, after that dragon, and I don't remember his name, after he is kind of taken over by Nag the Nameless, and then he is eventually defeated, then like his minions, like the other sea dragons, they kind of convert to the good side, like the light side of the world, and they become forces of good, which is interesting. I also thought too, Stephen, you mentioned Chronicles of Narnia and how Eustace became the dragon, because I think that's a theme through the Bible too, which we can get to, that a lot of times people can become the dragon. They can become this force of evil or force of chaos in the world. When you are aligning yourself with evil, when you're aligning yourself with something that is against God, against creation, then you take on this form of the dragon like Eustace did. And that is something that we need to be, fighting against, but also that we can be freed from as well.
Yeah, I think that's more the type of dragon I like, where it represents something wrong and twisted and evil. But yes, people can become dragon-like or literal dragons like Eustace. I grew up with, I think the first dragon story I read was the Dragonlance series in around 6th, 7th grade. And then The Hobbit. Now, I think in Dragonlance, it's been so long, they were kind of good and bad, but it was more about the relationship with humans that made them that way, so that they could be allies, they could be enemies, but they were definitely formidable creatures. What doesn't really connect with me is dragons is just regular animals. I'm like, oh, but that takes away the fun. Like, dragons are supposed to be super dangerous. But the very next fandom I got into in middle school was Shadowrun. This is a role-playing game about sort of this cyberpunk future with magic and monsters. And there's a very well-known phrase in Shadowrun, which is never deal with a dragon. Because in the world of Shadowrun, the dragons are in charge of all the megacorps. And so they are very cunning and very abusive bosses, if you will. And so if you are, as a character, if you are trying to make a deal with a certain corporation and you've got to work with the dragon, just get out of there, because it's not going to go well.
That's hilarious. I just got this picture of a dragon at the end of an extremely long, shiny boardroom table, arranging some evil predatory practice of some kind. I do like How to Train Your Dragon. And oddly enough, like way back in 2010 before it came out, I did not think I would, but the trailer won me over and the reviews won me over because, back then and as now, there's concern about entertainment going woke, and the dragon being presented as a symbol of evil. And now, we've misunderstood the dragons. They can actually be tamed. Like, this seems to me a recipe for disaster, because then you've got this notion of the kids understanding that what the parents called evil wasn't really evil, and it's perfectly fine to live with them in peace and harmony. And yet the story didn't go that direction. The story did make it that this was a story about a father and son who needed to understand one another. And then ultimately, by the end of the trilogy, you've got villains who are abusing dragons as the symbol of creation, but also dragons who've been made to go evil because of what humans have done to them. But they're also good humans. So evil dragons, evil humans, good humans. And ultimately, I think it ends up incidentally honoring a key biblical concept, which is the stewardship of creation by man, and the fact that human flaws make this, at best, a mixed result. We cannot tame the dragons, at least not now, not for good, but maybe someday we will. The Christian looks at that and sees Jesus as the hero of that narrative too. I also really enjoy shape-shifting dragons, and if people change into dragons or vice versa, like that may bother some people, but it's a great way to set up our second sponsor, author Liam Corley, with a sci-fi novel, probably free of dragons. Nevertheless, it's called Changelings Insurgents. Commander Talrun didn't travel from the 26th century to kidnap a forgotten healer, but he will, if that's what it takes to save his mutant son. To end the war between humans and their mutant offspring, Talrun recruits a criminal, a scientist, and a scholar to search for genes that will purge the mutation. But trusting each other turns out to be the real fight. Changelings Insurgents is a debut science fiction novel by Liam Corley, published by Millspeak Books, and it's available wherever fine books are sold. Get the links in our show notes for episode 203, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast. We'll also have the cover image there for you. Chapter 2 now, going back in time a little bit further than these newer stories, which are based on older classical literature. So chapter 2 is called Slaying the Dragons in Ancient Legends. Now, I'm not as up on my mythology as I would like to be, but I thought I remembered that Beowulf, way back in the day, fought a dragon, and it turns out he actually had 3 foes, not just Grendel, but Grendel's mother and a dragon as well. If anyone else has actually read Beowulf, points in its original language, whatever that is, like, please raise your hand and fill in our faithful listeners.
I think it was English. Wasn't it the first English poem or the oldest one that we've discovered?
It was extremely old English or
very,
something.
Very old,
Yeah,
old
it was
with
first written in
English.
Old English, which is basically illegible to us modern English speakers.
Tolkien had a translation, though, with commentary. I know that was published fairly recently, so I guess I ought to get that if I'm to talk about it on a podcast.
Yeah. I read it in high school and college and basically just brushed up. But yes, there is a dragon. And from what I understand, this is kind of the first image of a modern dragon, like a fire-breathing beast who lives in a cave and he hoards gold. And prior to this, most of the dragons were actually sea dragons. They were like these big serpentine creatures that lived in the sea, not in a cave. So this is kind of like the Beowulf is kind of the first image in literature of what we would consider like our modern dragon.
Did the Beowulf dragon fly also? Just crawl?
I don't remember. Sorry.
Okay. I don't
think it's been a long time.
I don't think the dragon that St. George fought flew. I've got this medieval art pictured in my head of, this rather stiff-looking figure, St. George, probably still on the back of his horse, pointing the spear at the dragon, which is like barely the size of a horse and is looking rather scrawny and puny, wings hardly capable of flight. And he's kind of spitting out this rather pathetic jet of medieval-looking flame, and really doesn't seem like that much of a fight, at least in the artwork. And yet I know the original story has been absolutely formative. Like St. George, apparently this real person, maybe this sort of St. Nicholas effect where it was a legend, or did he maybe actually fight some kind of a creature, and then, like a medieval Davy Crockett, the tale grew in the telling? I don't know, but it certainly formed the basis for many other Western legends and mythologies about knights versus dragons.
Yeah, I just realized it's the flight aspect that makes dragons so formidable, because how in the world do you fight something that can move in 3 dimensions when you can only move in 2, right? And, just think about when a wasp gets in your house, how crazy that is. And yet you can swat a wasp with your hand. I mean, you probably shouldn't. And, we're talking about something the size of like an 18-wheeler that's flying through the air. It's interesting to think about the older stories where they weren't flying versus where they were. But I would definitely rather not have a flying dragon if I had to choose.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure exactly when dragons took on flight in the stories. If the listeners are interested, there's a book. It's called The Penguin Book of Dragons, and it goes through the history of all of the dragons in literature throughout the ages. And actually, I was a little disappointed. It doesn't go back quite as far in history as I would have liked. It starts with ancient Greece. I haven't read through all of the stories, but it would be interesting to see at what point those dragons start to take on wings and flight, or if they had wings but they didn't fly at first, and then they flew. And so yeah.
Yeah, well, I know that in ancient and in modern China, they don't view the dragon as something evil. When I traveled there about 20 years ago, that was a question a lot of people had for me. They said, why do Americans or the West, why do they consider dragons evil? And it's like these, dark creatures that you have to fight. And I thought, I don't know. That's just how it always is in our culture. But they're like, oh yeah, in China, the dragon is a very good creature, and it brings you, good luck, blessings, and all this kind of stuff. And so many different cultural festivals, you see people kind of in these giant dragon costumes. And actually, recently I saw a pretty cool demonstration where they had all these drones in a swarm that made it look like a dragon flying through the air. Sort of like a pointillism effect, if you know what I mean, like just all these little tiny points of light in different colors, and it made it look like a slithering dragon. But to them, that's not a scary thing. That's not, oh no, the dragon's going to burn down your apartment. It's, hey, cool, a dragon. So it's again, that's something I'm very curious about. Like, when did that come into their minds culturally as a good thing? Did it start out as something bad and became good, or was it always just a good thing? And that goes to what you said earlier, Stephen, of maybe the dragon as created by God was original. I mean, we know that everything God created was good. So there was a time when these creatures, whatever they really were a positive force for good, not an evil force for chaos. And that's kind of fascinating to think about. It's like that, Pat. Well, we'll get to this in chapter 3, but it's fascinating to think about these really scary creatures being something good.
So for those who've fallen down into the creation science rabbit hole, which is a really cozy place to be, I think, were dragons real? Show of hands. I say yes. Yes. Probably wings, almost certainly fire, definitely giant lizards who were scary and maybe lived in caves and certainly swam under the ocean. I'm almost certain those were real. Why aren't they here anymore? All the knights killed them. I mean, what can you say? It's a bit difficult for
like
dragons and humans to get along. Yeah, How to Train Your Dragon's explanation is as good a reason as any. Yeah, you don't find wild flocks or wild herds of bison, roaming the American plains for the same reason you don't find flocks of dragons soaring in the skies. I think that's basically the reason. Okay, so Laurie, you raise your hand. Dragons, real. Go.
Yeah, I think so, because you mentioned some of the things, answers in Genesis, maybe what our concept of dinosaurs, the ancient world would have seen as dragons. And I think just the quantity of literature through the ancient world, going way back, even before the Bible was written, there were stories, and I would love to talk about some of these too, stories of ancient dragons. And these were sea creatures. These were like lizards, serpents in the sea, these big, monstrous, kind of like the Leviathan, in other cultures, even before the Bible was written. And I just feel like the prevalence of those stories in the ancient world, in so many different cultures, like almost every ancient culture and modern culture, you will find stories of dragons. And it's like, well, okay, maybe, it's like when you think about the flood. Well, there were stories of the flood in all of these ancient cultures. Well, probably because the flood actually happened. Probably there's stories that trickle down because of starting with truth. And I kind of think the same thing about dragons too. I mean, I don't know where they went or what they, whether they breathed fire or whether they actually look like our modern version of a dragon. But I do think that these big monstrous sea creatures or land creatures, I think that they existed. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there a particular story of a sea creature or one of these ancient dragons that comes to your mind in your studies that you've done?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot. Back even before Abraham, there was like an ancient Indian myth about a sea serpent who was slain by a storm god. And that's the other thing too. All of these stories, the dragon is always killed by the storm god, which is so interesting. There's another Hittite story, which is around the time of Abraham, where Iluyanka, the sea dragon, was also slain by a storm god. Another one that might be even more familiar to our listeners would be the Canaanite myth of the storm god Baal, who is this, he defeats Lotan, or actually it translates into Leviathan in Hebrew. He defeats this dragon, this serpent that lives in the sea. And this is these are manuscripts that were found in the Ugaritic city, the city of Ugarit, I think. And the sea dragons, in all of these different cultures, these sea dragons represented chaos, just like they do now. Like they represented chaos and evil, and it was something that had to be defeated. And it was always the storm god that would defeat them. And then another one that would probably be recognizable would be in the Babylonian epic of creation. It's an old ancient myth. It's one of like the earliest documents like in literature that they have, where Marduk, the god Marduk, slays Tiamat, who's a dragon. She's a primordial sea dragon, and he has to destroy her before he creates the world in this Babylonian mythology, which is so interesting because as we talk about a little bit later, we can talk about in chapter 3 about just what this means for Christianity, but like God didn't have to slay any dragons before he created the world. Yahweh, he created the sea creatures. He was the ultimate creator. He was the first. He was he was before all time. And so the Hebrews would have seen that as like, oh, he didn't have to, he must be much greater than this god Marduk because he didn't have to defeat the monster before creating the world. He just was able to create the world. So anyway, so just so many. And Egyptian, there's one in Egypt, and then of course Greek. Once you get up into Greek literature, there's Hercules, who killed the Hydra, and Jason and killed the dragon that was guarding the golden fleece, and Zeus had to battle Typhon, and Apollo kills Python, which is essentially the same story. But anyway, all through history and literature, both before the time of when the Bible was written, also during the same time the Bible was written. Like, this was the culture that the Hebrews would have understood. They were living in Egypt for 400 years. Abraham was from Ur in Mesopotamia. Like, these were the gods that they were worshiping. This was the culture that they would have understood about all of these stories about the storm god defeating the dragon.
I think I can say, even on a Christian podcast, that Marduk totally slays. Baal totally slays all these storm gods. It's fascinating then to see in the book of Job, we'll get to in a moment, these presentations of God in control of not just the thunder and the lightning and the sea dragon and all of the things. God treating Leviathan as his pet. One of the books, by the way, that I'm thinking of, the newer books that has a magnificent dragon on the front, makes me think of our third sponsor, and that's Divine Summons by the co-founder of Realm Makers, Rebecca P. Miner. That has a magnificent armored dragon, is book one of the Wind Riders saga. And that's one of the many books you'll find at the Realm Makers Bookstore Vendor Hall event Saturday with the Realm Makers Conference. That's coming up this July 18th through 20th. At the Sheraton Westport Chalet Hotel in St. Louis. We've been there several times for this Christian-run event with an all-star faculty that helps creators of fantasy, science fiction, and beyond train in their craft. They can learn from the best. They can collaborate with one another. They can dress up for the costume banquet on Friday night. And then Saturday night, maybe one of my favorite elements of the conference, they throw open the doors to the bookstore, and then everybody gets to come in. That'll be Saturday, July 20th. So even if you're not a writer or you're not going to the whole conference, you can show up and meet a whole lot of these all-star folks at the Realm Makers sale event Saturday, July the 20th in St. Louis. Lorehaven will be there. We always are. We've got our table. So if you want to talk with Zach and I and other staff writers, we'll be there. And a whole bunch of other fantastic Christian creators. So you can get more information about the Realm Makers 2024 conference, which also has a virtual attending option, by the way, in our show notes for episode 203, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast. All right, let's talk about the best book of all. What's your favorite book, oh Christian? It's the Bible. So, of course, in chapter 3, we got to talk about slaying that dragon, the devil, in the scripture. But I've got to do another shout out to my boy Leviathan in Job 41, who is basically Godzilla. And this is where, as I've mentioned, God says, that powerful sea creature you've heard about in the legends, or maybe even heard a friend of a friend of a friend tell you about it. Oh, Job, well, that's my pet. And God says, starting in chapter 18, his sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. Brief pause. If you weren't counting, that is 4 different verses talking about how this creature breathes fire. And God is speaking about this in the present tense after he's already described what can only be a brachiosaur. And then he's also describing creatures like the horse and the ostrich. So God is not saying, hey, I'm switching from real nature to a mythology here. God is acting as if this creature is real. Verse 22. In his neck abides strength, and terror dances before him. The folds of his flesh stick together, firmly cast on him and immovable. His heart as hard as stone, hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. At the crashing they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it does not avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. And there's so much more. God is waxing poetic about this beast. God seems to really like Leviathan, and yet use him as this sign of danger. And as you mentioned, Laurie, chaos. This is a creature of the sea, a symbol of chaos in the sea of chaos. And it's a magnificent read. Just read the whole chapter and try not to think of Godzilla. That's my challenge there. But in the rest of the Bible, dragons get slain. Laurie, you mentioned Revelation 12. So kind of starting in the end game there, what do we see about that dragon, the devil, most detailed in Revelation 12?
Yeah, so in Revelation 12, we see this great dragon, and it says, the great dragon was thrown down. And you're thinking, wait, who is this dragon? Well, the writer tells you right here in the scripture. It says this great dragon, that ancient serpent. And immediately the Hebrew readers would have been like, oh, the ancient serpent. Genesis 3:15, when God cursed the serpent in the garden. And that's the Hebrew word nahash. And they would have immediately been, yes, we know this ancient serpent. He's been the one that has been deceiving us. And then it goes on to say, this ancient serpent, lest there's any question about who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth and his angels were thrown down with him. So when we interpret the Bible, we have the privilege of looking at the entire Bible. We can interpret the Old Testament from the New Testament. And so we can look back at Genesis 3 when, that serpent that God cursed and that tempted Adam and Eve, we know, okay, this was the devil, this was Satan, this was the deceiver who has been deceiving the whole world. But the most amazing part of the verse here says he was thrown down and his angels were thrown down with him and he is defeated.
Yeah.
I just now realized, by the way, that the Hebrew for serpent sounds like parcel tongue.
Yeah.
That's got to be intentional somewhere.
Absolutely. I thought about that too.
The key word I think from that passage is great. The great dragon. So it's like the ultimate example of a thing. And this is what makes me think that, there were actual dragons in these ancient times, because it doesn't really make sense to me that the writer of Revelation would be saying, here is, Satan is the pinnacle of this mythological thing. He's, because it's like, well, how can you be the ultimate thing that doesn't exist? And it doesn't seem like the way that the writers of the Bible would speak. They wouldn't speak in these, they spoke in metaphorical ways, but it's so like, I almost feel like interpreting that as dragons didn't exist is like a modernist way of looking at it, because we would say today, Jesus is the ultimate Luke Skywalker, right? Jesus is the one and true Paul Atreides. It's like the youth pastor joke, right? Like, you've heard of artificial intelligence, but have you heard of a supreme intelligence that never sleeps, that you can talk to all the time without a cell phone? That's a Babylon Bee thing. That's like how we talk about the Bible now. We kind of, it's like eisegesis through pop
Speak
culture.
for yourself. I don't do that. I don't want to do that. You're making my mouth curdle, and I didn't even say it, Zach. Thanks for that.
Right. But I don't think this is how people in the Bible thought about it. And, Laurie, what you said about Marduk defeating Tiamat, and that's why these ancient peoples worship Marduk, or why they worship Baal, is because, again, it's like, okay, maybe they just had a myth that Baal defeated the dragon or that Marduk defeated Tiamat. But why then did they worship something they made up? Like, that doesn't really make sense to me. I mean, you see people kind of, you love Harry Potter, but I don't see you making an altar to Harry Potter now, and even people that love Harry Potter don't get that far into it, where they think Harry's a real person that will listen to their prayers or something. Well, maybe there's people like that. I don't know, but that's not a common thing, right? And so the idea of the ancients making up a myth and then worshiping the mythical savior, I think there's got to be more to it than just it's totally made up.
There was an element where they believed it was real. They believed that, there was actually this person, Marduk, who became a god, or he was a god. I forget. Exactly
or like a fallen angel, maybe that helped them out or something. That's kind of what I have leaned towards thinking. Stephen, that passage from Job is pretty convincing, right? Because earlier I was going to say, I could see, some kind of creature that sort of got blown out of proportion, but that people were able to ride around on and tame, and then put sort of like a torch in front of its mouth for when it exhaled methane or something. And then it created this, kind of flamethrower type thing. I could see that sort of thing happening, especially in the pre-flood world, because hey, anything goes, right? In the pre-flood world, because it was
sure. Why not
insane.
Spaceships?
Yeah, right.
Why not aliens?
And because you can't really disprove it, right? But I could see something like that technologically, in a sense, happening. But in Job, it's talking about this creature breathing fire all on
underwater
its own.
too.
Underwater,
This creature from the sea. Well, maybe he raises his head out of the sea, like Nessie, and then breathes fire.
That's
a little bit more plausible.
Yeah, he comes up
How
out
else
of the
could
water
the sailors see it? Yeah,
to breathe the fire. Yeah. Did you guys know there's a dragon in the very first chapter of the Bible? In Genesis chapter 1:21, it says, and you were talking, one of you mentioned, well, when God created these creatures, he created the Leviathan, and if he created them, then they were good. They started out good. And that's absolutely right, because in Genesis 1:21, it says, so God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. That phrase, the great sea creatures, that's NASB. ESV translates it, or maybe it's NIV, translates it, the great sea monsters. But that phrase is actually the Hebrew word tanin. And if you do a word search, Blue Letter Bible is a great resource. If you do a word search on tanin, you'll find that almost every other time that word tanin is used throughout the Bible, it's translated dragon. In Revelation, Revelation would have been Greek. But so a great example is Isaiah 27:1. And this is NASB. It says, in that day, the Lord will punish Leviathan. There we're talking about Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. And that serpent there is the word Nahash, which we see back in Genesis 3:15. Yeah, I know. I love that. With his fierce and great and mighty sword, even Leviathan, the twisted serpent, and he will kill the dragon who lives in the sea. And that word dragon is the Hebrew word tanin. So all there in that same verse, in that one verse, we see Leviathan, we see Nahash, and we see tanin, and they're all used interchangeably. They're all referring to that same creature. And that word tanin is back in Genesis 1:21, where it says God created the tanin in the sea, and it was good. And the Hebrew readers would have read this and be like, wow, like you said, God created these amazing, ferocious creatures, whether they believed that they were actually real creatures or whether they were like equating them with the stories and the cultures around them. They knew who these creatures were. They were familiar with these great sea creatures, these dragons, these Leviathan, and they're like, wow, our God, he's the bomb. He's the one that created these creatures and put them in the sea. And he didn't have to defeat them. Like, he created them, he tamed them, like he had them as his pets. He is the powerful one. And then we see throughout the rest of the Bible the same imagery of God slaying the dragon, slaying the beast and destroying the dragon. And I think that just resonated so much with the readers of the Old Testament, with the Hebrew readers, because they're like, yes, our God is the serpent slayer. He is the dragon slayer.
Yeah, the Bible writers either knew of these creatures or they knew of the myths.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was common knowledge to them. And that's just wild to think about, right? They were really living in a different world, and I think than we realize sometimes.
They didn't have the internet. They couldn't just, they didn't have the World Book Encyclopedia on their shelf where they could go and look up, well, are dragons real? Could Google it. They didn't know. The world was unexplored. A lot of the world wasn't explored, and it was chaotic, and the sea, like, they didn't know what was out there. And in their minds, like, that's what any unexplored area of the world was, chaos, and that's where the dragons live. Like on ancient maps, you see on the edges of the maps pictures of dragons, and it says, like, here be dragons. Like, this is what we know, and this is what we don't know, and that's where the dragons live.
I think what we see throughout the development of the idea in the Bible is history became legend and legend became myth. And yet the Apostle Peter says in 2 Peter 1, for we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So some of the dragon motifs and all of that, how much of that in the prophecies is symbol and how much is literal. I think it's pretty clear that Leviathan from Job 41 is meant to be taken literally, but God destroying Leviathan as the symbol of evil and raging chaos from the sea is figurative, and yet it points to a far greater reality. And Christians understand that dragons, sea creatures, whatever they are, originally created good, and then a key to understanding how Christians see creatures and nature now is that nature now groans under the consequence of suffering caused by human sin. That's how humans see that third party. There's God and humankind, and the nature is the third party. Well, nature's not evil, but it does groan. And there are things that nature does, whether it's creatures killing people or storms and volcanoes and earthquakes. Like, those are the groanings of the earth that do kill people, that give us something to see, that reminds us, okay, this world is not as it should be. We need a king now, a hero, to come back and set things right, to retame nature, to be the ultimate steward of nature that Adam and Eve were supposed to do until they failed. And so that's why we celebrate at the Easter season, is Christ arriving, not as this, God of storms, not at first, but as this humble teacher who's fully God and fully man. He has a few years to hit the ground running and gather up his disciples, heal some people, raise a few people from the dead. But ultimately, it's all about not his good teaching and his morality and all that, but it's all about his death and resurrection on purpose by his own will. And then his disciples get to work after he raises to life and goes to heaven. They get to work putting the church together and then prophesying of that time when the hero, the dragon slayer, will come back to make it absolutely clear to the entire earth that he has already defeated the devil and his legions. Colossians 2 here says, starting in verse 13, "And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross." So we'll talk more about that in our next podcast episode. "Jesus disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him." A lot of Christians read that and they think demonic powers, Satan, the fake imposter, temporary at best God of this world. You mentioned earlier, Laurie, that the sea creature that God will defeat, the Leviathan in Isaiah, comes out of the sea. I'm guessing it's no coincidence then that right after Revelation 12, with all the symbolism about the dragon and the stars falling down and all of this, you then get this prophecy of a beast from the sea. A lot of Christians read into that, some kind of future dictator of some kind.
Kraken.
Well, in this context, it's like the ultimate ruler of rulers, like, the worst Caesar you can imagine. He rises from the sea. He makes you take his mark. He does all kinds of dystopian stuff, and he's got a false prophet and everything. And then by the end, you got almost this kind of counterfeit Trinity effect, the devil / dragon, and the beast and the false prophet. So all these symbols kind of get split apart and then recombined. But the beast from the sea, like, that is basically a human being-ish figure here, whatever your eschatology is, who's hearkening back to those prophecies. And Laurie, I just cannot second enough your recommendation that you read the Bible from start to finish, like realizing it's not just a bunch of pieces put together over time, but it is ultimately all one story. The human beings telling the rest of the story knew the older portions, but ultimately we know that the capital A author, God, was directing the plot from start to finish.
I often wonder what the Hebrews, what the Jews in first century, the ones that knew Jesus, his disciples, they were surprised by his death. They were like, "No, Jesus, this isn't what you're supposed to do. Surely this can't be the way." Because, and I wonder if they had they had obviously the Old Testament, all of the Old Testament prophecies and Old Testament stories, but I wonder if they had this image of this dragon slayer in mind. Like, no, wait, you're supposed to kill the dragon. You're not supposed to die. You're supposed to be the one coming on the clouds of heaven, and you're the conquering hero. And Jesus was like, actually, what you don't understand is, in order to defeat the dragon, who is the symbol of chaos and death, I actually have to die. Like, I have to enter into that and submit to death in order to defeat this agent of death, this agent of chaos. And I wonder if his disciples were thinking of that, like, wait, that's not right. You're supposed to be the hero. How is it that you have to die?
Well, and you see that when they're like, let's take up swords or let's go die with you. They saw the Roman Empire as the dragon.
Yeah.
And that was the evil creature from the sea that had risen up and conquered everything, and was hoarding all the gold of all these different nations, not just their own. And how in the world do you defeat something that massive and that sprawling? It's very much the dragon that they face. And Jesus did not attack it in the way that they thought, but he eventually he did defeat it, and not just the Roman Empire, but he defeated the much bigger dragon that was over everyone, the dragon of sin that holds everyone under its spell. And that was, again, just not even what was on their radar. They're just thinking of the human kingdoms, like get rid of these evil oppressors. But he's like, aha, but what is driving the oppression? Like, what is causing them to oppress you? That's the bigger thing we got to deal with, that I have to defeat, and not in the way that you think I'm going to.
Well, that's why we emphasize in this series the 3 foes that Christ defeated: that dragon, the devil; human sin; our own villainy. That's our next episode. Then after that, we'll talk about suffering and thorns and thistles and those other problems that Christ had to defeat that are caused by Satan and human sin. Laurie, I think folks will want to see an awesome dragon photo that is on the front of your book, Rise of the Enemy, a Dragon Slayer Bible story. I'm looking at it right now. That is one absolutely boss, fire-breathing dragon. I said photo, but it's an illustration. We don't have photos of dragons.
No, it's
yet.
a real photo.
It's a real photo. You went out and got that. There we go. Yeah, that's some kind of weird National Geographic documentary. It's been hushed up by the establishment. But I want to hear more about this Dragon Slayer Bible series that you've put together as we draw to a close. Obviously, the first one is out, and you're working on more. Like, what gave you the idea for this, and what's next for this series?
Yeah, so this series is a collection of devotions and Bible stories specifically for preteen boys.
Thank you. Just thank you for that.
You're
That's
welcome.
awesome.
You're very welcome. I have 4 of my own boys, and my passion is for them to know the Lord and to get excited about the Bible. And, they would sit for hours while I read Harry Potter, and they were just enthralled, and they loved this story. And I was like, why not the Bible? Why not the Bible? Look, there's dragons in the Bible. There's heroes. There's slaying the dragons. There's this like epic stories that are echoed in so many of these other fantasy books that we read. I was like, so why can't we get excited about the Bible? And so that was my goal in writing this series, and it kind of developed over time into what it is now. But basically, Jesus is the dragon slayer. Satan is an evil dragon, and in the books, he's depicted as an actual dragon. So, he's got scales, and he's breathing fire, and he's sneaking around in the bushes trying to deceive the people. I like to say that it's kind of like Frank Peretti meets the Jesus Storybook Bible. They're Bible stories, but then we kind of get a glimpse behind the curtain of what is happening in the spiritual world. What was happening in the Garden of Eden when the serpent was tempting Adam and Eve, things like that. So in the very first book, Rise of the Enemy, it is the war in heaven from Revelation 12. And I know there's some debate as to whether this war in heaven actually took place like before the creation of the world, or if this took place when Jesus died on the cross, or if this is a future. So anyway, I that's my concession that I understand that. But for this series, the war in heaven took place. That's when Satan fell from heaven. He was kicked out of heaven, and he turns into this dragon. So that kind of sets the stage for the rest of the series. Then we have good, we have evil, we have the enemy. But God promises, hey, I'm going to be sending a dragon slayer. And so throughout the series, the characters in the Bible are looking forward to like the dragon slayer's coming. He's going to defeat this evil dragon. It's part narrative and it's part devotional. So the first section is a fictional retelling. It reads very much like a chapter book. There are fantasy elements because, Satan turns into a dragon, and he has scales and is breathing fire. And he's, fighting. There's a sword fight with the angels. The angels are fighting against each other. And then the second part of the book is devotions and Bible studies to help our boys dig deeper and to understand what this really means, the significance of it. So the first book is all about putting on the armor of God, spiritual warfare. How do we recognize the lies of this evil dragon? Do we need to be afraid of him? Why do we not need to be afraid of him? How did Jesus eventually conquer him? So that's book 1, Rise of the Enemy, and that's available on Amazon. That launched in November. And yes, I'm working on book 2, which I'm really excited about. I'm in the final stages of edits, and I'm actually launching a Kickstarter campaign for book 2. Book 2 is called Garden of Secrets. And the Kickstarter campaign runs from April 3rd through April 19th, 2024. So as you're listening to this, it might be ready to go right now. You can check it out. Dragonslayerbible.com is the website where I have all of this information, so you can follow along there. But so Garden of Secrets is told from the perspective of Seth, son of Adam and Eve, and it takes place about 140 years after Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And I call it speculative biblical fiction because there is one verse in the Bible about Seth, but I've turned it into an 11-chapter book. But it's like, what would have the world been like after the curse? And I'll just read a quick blurb from the back of this book. A mysterious prophecy, an ancient curse, an invisible dragon. Seth's parents had secrets they wouldn't share with him. Why had they been kicked out of the garden? Why had the king cursed the land? He wanted to know more. He had to find out the truth. But finding answers to his questions would prove more challenging than he imagined. In the second book of the Dragon Slayer Bible series, readers will experience a world where the consequences of sin have affected every part of creation, even the animals. Can Seth learn his parents' secret before the dragon destroys him? The stories are very biblically based. I have a theological editor who reads through them and checks to make sure that, I'm not creating heresy here, but they are fictional stories imagining what would have that been like. We don't have a record of that in the Bible. And then through the story, Seth's character arc is that, at the beginning, he doesn't think God loves him. He thinks that the king must be this evil tyrant because he kicked his parents out of the garden, and now the animals want to eat him. And there's like these Teratorns, which are prehistoric vulture animals that are trying to hunt him down. And he's like, we have to work, and there's thorns and thistles in the land. And like, I don't get it. He doesn't think that the king loves him. So, but through the course of the story, he learns from his parents. And then also we have Michael the Archangel show up and have a conversation with him. But he keeps trying to sneak back to the Garden of Eden. He wants to see the cherubim that are guarding the Garden of Eden, and he wants to find out the truth, and he's trying to learn more and more. And then finally, by the end, he learns the full story and realizes that the king really does love him in all of the ways that the king actually showed his love to his parents. So we get a really good, solid retelling of the Garden of Eden through Adam and Eve, 150 years after the fact, how they're kind of retelling and recounting their experience there. So it's a really fun story that boys will love. And then the devotion part dives into like the text of the gospel, the text of the scriptures, looking at Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 3, and just some of the implications and the applications for us. Things like identifying the lies of the dragon, learning to be content with what God has given you. Adam and Eve were not content. They wanted more. They weren't content with their position before God. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? And then, of course, looking forward to the coming of the Dragon Slayer. Like, what is the significance of the cherubim in the garden? And so all of those things.
So, Laurie, what's the link for that again to go learn about books 1 and 2?
Yes. So dragonslayerbible.com. And you can learn about book 1. There's a link to purchase that on Amazon. And then there is a link to follow along with the Kickstarter campaign. So if it's before April 3rd, there's a link that you can just say, alert me when this is live, let me know when this goes live, and then you'll be alerted when the Kickstarter is up and running. If you're listening after April 3rd, the link will be live, and you'll just be able to view the page for that Kickstarter campaign.
Well, this sounds absolutely fantastic. Laurie, I'm so glad that you brought your wealth of research and biblical knowledge and the care of a mother for stuff that boys like, and this adventure story that is intrinsic to the Word of God and echoed throughout history right up until these modern fantasy stories about dragons and how, sometimes they're cute and cuddly and you can tame them and fly on them and all of that, but sometimes they're crazy and evil and they need to go down. And that is what Jesus has done, and I'm glad that you are exalting him through your work. So go to dragonslayerbible.com and sign up for that, and also find the Redeeming the Chaos podcast, especially if you are a boy mom and need to figure out how that works. Anything else to say about the podcast, Laurie, before we close out?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say one more thing. I actually have a link to a free ebook for book 1. So if you want to read book 1 as an ebook, there's a link on my website that you can download that free ebook. Your boys, if you have young boys, they're going to want a print copy. But because there's places that you can write in, there's journal entries, things like that. But if you are listening and you want to preview it, go over to dragonslayerbible.com and there is a link to download a free ebook copy of Book 1, Rise of the Enemy.
All right, Laurie, thank you so much, and Godspeed on your journey, raising boys into men and slaying the dragons that you find on the journey.
Stephen and Zach, thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun today.
Hey, Stephen, just now I was going through the Amazon reviews of Laurie's book, Rise of the Enemy, and I noticed a theme from several reviewers, which was, oh, my 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old son does not like to read books, but he loved this one and could not put it down. In fact, in a few cases, they read it in like a couple of days. And there's even a picture of a group of boys reading this book. And so I absolutely love this, that this is a series written with young boys in mind, which is, of course, her wheelhouse, having 4 sons of her own. So I think this could definitely be something fantastic for our listeners who have young boys. But now let's head over to the comm station. I'm going to read a couple comments here from our last episode about how our reading habits changed during the lockdowns. This was from episode 202. These are comments from our Lorehaven Guild, our exclusive Discord server that you, our listener, can join. And our first comment is from Mahina, who said, quote, "During COVID, I helped take care of my 80-year-old grandma, and we were scared. The 2 things we could actually do together physically and rule-wise were go to the public pool to swim and go to the library. Those were the only outings for a while for Grandma, so that's when I started getting back into reading. I loved reading in middle school and high school, but had stopped as an adult. I actually found Lorehaven after being disappointed with library books with hidden agendas and explicit content. Now my life is on a completely different course career-wise, and I love my God-honoring stories. I find solace from the scrolling and can see God's designs in fantastical fiction." End quote. That's fabulous, Mahina. That's so encouraging to hear that. I'm so glad that has helped you get back into reading. And also we heard from Amanda, who said, quote, "I was reading then, but I think being shut in for so long was one of the things that brought me to something of a meeting with God over some behavior in my life. Like the things I was reading or watching, which were not good and definitely not healthy. Stories in principle are a gift from God, but certainly not all stories are good. And I had gotten sucked in by many of those. I think I'd spent too many years whacking my discernment with a hammer. So in the years since, it's been a process of scraping away the bad, and I read different books now. Though I often still feel unsure about my choices, I don't want to fall into that same trap again." End quote. So, man, that's a fantastic conversation just right there. That you've got one person who said, I used to be a reader, then I wasn't, and now I am again. I love that story. But also this other story of, well, I was a reader of a lot of things that I now regret. And now I'm reading much healthier things, much more Christ-honoring stories. And that is so awesome. Like, that's exactly why we're doing this podcast, why we do reviews on the Lorehaven website. So to you, our listener, we would love to know your thoughts about this episode. What are some of your favorite dragons and stories, whether they're good, evil, or neutral dragons? So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com, or you can comment on the episode page, or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or, of course, you can comment in the Lorehaven Guild.
Next on Fantastical Truth, we'll continue this series, He Saves Us. When our hero Jesus died to atone for sin and resurrected himself, he did not defeat only the devil, he also did this to deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery, says the author of Hebrews. Jesus, our hero, is a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. He saves us from our own villainy. Let's rejoice in that truth that Christ has conquered suffering and our sin and that dragon, the devil, as we move into the resurrection season, but not without pausing to remember the bad stuff. It's fun sometimes to study the foes that Christ has defeated and how they're echoed throughout the ages in the stories that we love as we continue to seek and find Christ's fantastical truth.